Acting Speaker, further to my contribution on the 18th of June, I rise to again support the parliamentary inquiry into workplace surveillance undertaken by the Legislative Assembly, Economy and Infrastructure Committee that I'm proudly part of. We heard a mountain of evidence from a range of employee, academic, community organisations and indeed business representatives which clearly demonstrated that we need to modernise Victoria's workplace surveillance, monitoring and privacy legislation to keep pace with the growing and evolving employer workplace monitoring technology ecosystem. Based on this extensive feedback, the inquiry found that while there are legitimate reasons for employers to undertake surveillance such as to ensure workers' health and safety, surveillance can become problematic when employers use surveillance covertly for other purposes. And if left unchecked, growing and evolving employer methods of surveillance are increasingly raising privacy concerns, causing distress for employees when their employers' surveillance practices are unreasonable, excessive and inaccessible by the employee. Workplace surveillance, we also found that's excessive and lacks transparency, has been shown to have a significant negative impact on employees' morale, job satisfaction and commitment to their organisation. And it's also been shown that surveillance can intensify work, adversely affect employees' mental and physical health and exacerbate the power imbalance between employers and employees. And that's why the committee put forward 29 comprehensive findings and recommendations, which including recommendation 1, the Victorian Government introduced new standalone legislation, which I touched on in my last contribution. Recommendation 2, the Victorian Government include requirements for notification and disclosure in new workplace surveillance legislation that obliges employers to give 14 days written notice to workers of workplace surveillance and that the notice specifies the method, scope, timing and purpose of the surveillance and how the surveillance data will be used and stored. Recommendation 3, the Government include the requirement in new workplace surveillance legislation for employers to consult with employees before introducing or changing surveillance practices in the workplace. Recommendation 5, that the Government restrict covert workplace surveillance to cases where an employee is suspected of unlawful activity, the employer has obtained a court order to undertake the surveillance and an independent surveillance supervisor has been appointed to the case. Recommendation 7, the Victorian Government worked with employer groups to provide education and support services and material to employers about the changes to workplace surveillance regulation, help support them as part of any transition. Recommendation 9, the Victorian Government included a requirement in new workplace surveillance legislation that employers must inform employees who is collecting the workplace surveillance data, how the data is secured, stored and disposed of, and who can use the data for what purpose and how long the data will be kept. Recommendation 10, the Victorian Government included a provision in new workplace surveillance legislation that employers must not sell employees' personal data or any data collected about employees through surveillance to a third party. Recommendation 11, the Government included a requirement in new workplace surveillance legislation that employers must ensure that any third party they contract to collect or store workplace surveillance data takes reasonable steps to protect that data and complies with the workplace surveillance policy. Recommendation 13, the Government included a requirement that new legislation that employers, upon request by an employee, must give the employee access to a workplace surveillance data generated by the employee. Number 14, that the Privacy and Data Protection Act also include biometric data in the definition of sensitive information. And recommendation 18, that the Government appoint the Office of Victorian Information Commissioner, WorkSafe Victoria, or other appropriate body as a regulator and adequately resource it to oversee the new workplace surveillance legislation with the power to inspect workplaces, investigate and resolve complaints. And when combined, Acting Speaker, these provide for a balanced, pragmatic and sensible set of reforms that can help protect the interests of both employers and employees as we work particularly to help support more people to work from home. These reforms will become even more important than previously the case. But despite the overwhelming evidence and our comprehensive deliberations, at the 11th hour, the Liberals decided to lodge a dissenting report. And they did so for 2 reasons, Acting Speaker. One is that they wanted to keep the workplace surveillance protection racket going for their mates at the big end of town and big business. And we know who have been, through this inquiry, surveilling and collecting record amounts of data on their employees in unprecedented way and failing to disclose any of those systems or approaches to the employees. But number 2, it's because of recommendation 8 that the Victorian Government require employers to take all reasonable steps to prevent surveillance of an employee while at work by a party other than the employer without the employer's consent. Now, the Liberals have a conflict of interest on this, Acting Speaker, because we know the member for Caulfield, this would be in breach and contravene of his own approach of secretly recording his own colleagues without their consent, without any transparency, and would be in breach of recommendation number 8. We know...
Point of order, member for Pascoe Vale to take a seat. Point of order, member for Brighton.
On relevance, we are debating committee reports. This isn't a grievance debate where some cheap member makes cheap sledges. On relevance, this is an opportunity to debate committee reports. This is a clear sledge and outrageous abuse of this chamber. Time.
The member's time is over. Okay, member for Brighton.
Rule.
Thank you, member for Brighton.